Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you're new here, you've just stumbled onto a collection of true horror stories shared by real people who've experienced the unexplainable, the disturbing, and the downright terrifying. Today, we have something special for you. 6 consecutive stories all centered around one universal fear: the people living right next door. We've all had that neighbor, the one who watches a little too long, the one whose house feels wrong somehow, the one whose smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. Today's episode is called Creepy Neighbors, and these 6 stories will take you through experiences that started with small, unsettling moments and spiraled into something much, much worse. These accounts come from various online forums, personal submissions to horror story communities, and first-hand testimonies that have been shared anonymously. They've been adapted for clarity and pacing, but the core experiences remain as they were told. So turn down the lights, get comfortable, and whatever you do, don't look out your window just yet. If you enjoy what you hear today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more true horror stories every week. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Waving Man. Did you know that the average person spends nearly 3 hours a day looking out their windows? It's one of those mundane activities we don't even think about: checking the weather, watching the world go by, keeping an eye on the neighborhood. But for some people, looking out the window becomes something they can never do again. This story was posted on a paranormal experiences forum in 2019 by a user named TessieM447. She claimed she was sharing it as a warning, though she never specified what we should be warned about. The post was later deleted, but not before it was archived by several users who found it deeply disturbing. This is her account adapted from that original post. Tessa moved into her new apartment in Portland, Oregon, in late September. It was a ground-floor unit in an older building, nothing fancy, but affordable and close to her work. The apartment had large windows facing the street, which she loved at first. Natural light flooded the living room, and she could watch the neighborhood from her couch. The building across the street was older than hers, a 3-story walk-up with faded blue paint and a small, unkempt lawn. Tessa didn't pay much attention to it initially, but on her 3rd night there, she noticed something odd. A man stood in the window of the 2nd-floor apartment directly across from hers. He was middle-aged, maybe in his 50s, with a gaunt face and thinning hair. When Tessa looked back at him, he raised his hand and waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, back and forth, and his expression never changed. No smile, no acknowledgement. Just that hollow stare and the mechanical waving motion. Tessa quickly closed her blinds and tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. The next morning, she convinced herself she'd overreacted. Neighbors wave at each other. It's normal. But that evening, when she got home from work and opened her blinds to let in the fading sunlight, the man was already in his window, waiting. The moment she appeared, his hand went up, and he began waving again. Same slow rhythm, same blank expression. This continued every single day. Morning, afternoon, evening, it didn't matter when Tessa looked out her window. If it was daylight, the man was there. Always in the same position, always waving. She started keeping her blinds closed, but the thought of him standing there, waving at her covered windows, was somehow worse. 3 weeks after moving in, Tessa mentioned it to her downstairs neighbor. It's an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen. The moment she described the man, Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "You need to stop looking," she said, her voice urgent. "Don't open those blinds anymore. Don't give him attention." When Tessa pressed for an explanation, Mrs. Chen reluctantly told her about the previous tenant in Tessa's apartment, a young man named Michael. He'd also been bothered by the waving man. He'd even gone across the street to confront him, knocking on the door of the blue building. No one answered, but the waving continued. Michael became obsessed with it, according to Mrs. Chen. He started taking photos, documenting the times the man appeared, trying to find a pattern. Then one morning, Michael was found dead in his apartment. Heart attack, the coroner said, though he was only 32 and had no history of heart problems. His body was facing the window, and the blinds were open. Tessa felt ice crawl down her spine. She tried to rationalize it. Coincidence? Stress? She wasn't going to let some weird neighbor control her life. That night, out of defiance or stupidity, she opened her blinds after dark. The man's apartment was dark, and for the first time, she couldn't see him. Relief washed over her. Maybe he slept like a normal person. Maybe this would stop. Then she saw movement in the darkness of his window. Her eyes adjusted, and she realized he was still there, standing in the unlit room, waving. She could just barely make out the silhouette of his arm moving back and forth in the blackness. Tessa screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. When she looked again, the window was empty, but she couldn't shake the image. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, she called her landlord and broke her lease. She lost her deposit, but she didn't care. She packed her things and moved out within a week. Before she left, she made the mistake of looking one more time. The man was there, in his window. But he wasn't waving anymore. He was smiling, and somehow that was infinitely worse. Tessa never found out who he was or why he did what he did. But she included one final detail in her forum post that still haunts me. The day after she moved out, she drove past her old apartment. There was already a new tenant, a young woman, unpacking boxes. And across the street, in the second-floor window of the blue building, the man was back in position, waving. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. It helps more people find these accounts, and your support means everything. Let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The gift giver studies show that nearly 40% of people have never spoken to their next-door neighbors. We live in an age of privacy fences and closed doors, where proximity doesn't equal connection. But sometimes a neighbor crosses that boundary uninvited, and what seems like kindness reveals itself to be something else entirely. This story comes from a Reddit post made in 2021 on the Let's Not Meet subreddit. The original poster went by the username SarahK_23, and she shared this experience as a cautionary tale about ignoring gut feelings. Her post received thousands of upvotes and hundreds of comments from people who'd experienced similar situations. Here's what she shared. Sarah and her husband bought their first house in a quiet suburb outside of Cleveland, Ohio. It was a modest 2-bedroom with a small backyard perfect for their young family. Their next-door neighbor, an older man named Donald, introduced himself the day they moved in. He seemed pleasant enough, retired, widowed, living alone. He offered to help with the heavy boxes, which Sarah's husband politely declined, but they chatted for a few minutes about the neighborhood. The first gift appeared 3 days later. Sarah found it on their front porch when she went to get the mail, a small potted plant with a note that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood." Donald! It was a nice gesture. Sarah brought it inside and sent a thank you text to Donald's number, which he'd given them in case they ever needed anything. The second gift came less than a week later. A bag of homemade cookies. Then a few days after that, a DVD of a classic movie I thought you might enjoy. Then a magazine, and a small decorative item for the kitchen. The gifts kept coming every few days, always when Sarah was home alone during the day while her husband was at work. At first, Sarah appreciated the neighborly kindness, but it started to feel excessive. She mentioned it to her husband, who shrugged it off. "He's probably just lonely," he said. "He's trying to be nice." But Sarah couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that was building in her chest. Donald never left gifts when her husband's car was in the driveway, only when she was alone. One morning, Sarah was working from home when she heard a noise on her back porch. She looked out to see Donald standing there, peering through the sliding glass door into her kitchen. When he saw her looking, he smiled and held up another gift, a small decorative birdhouse. Sarah's heart pounded. How long had he been standing there? Had he been watching her? She didn't go to the door. Instead, she texted him, "Please leave gifts on the front porch only. Thank you." Donald's response came immediately. Just wanted to make sure you were home. Didn't want it to get stolen. But they lived in a safe neighborhood. Nothing ever got stolen from porches, and their backyard was fenced. He'd had to come through the side gate to get there. Sarah told her husband about the incident that evening, and he finally agreed it was odd. He offered to talk to Donald, but Sarah worried about causing conflict. They decided to just politely decline any future gifts. The gifts stopped, but something worse began. Sarah started noticing Donald in his yard whenever she was outside. If she went to check the mail, he'd suddenly appear, trimming bushes that didn't need trimming. She sat on the front porch. He'd come out to water plants he'd already watered, never approached or spoke to her, not anymore. But he was always there, in her peripheral vision, watching. Then Sarah started finding items in her yard that didn't belong to them. A garden gnome she'd never seen before. A wind chime that appeared on their back porch overnight. A small children's toy left near their fence line, even though their daughter never played in that part of the yard. When Sarah asked Donald if these items were his, he always denied it, seeming hurt that she would even ask. The breaking point came when Sarah's daughter, who was 4 years old, mentioned the man who watches from the window. Sarah's blood ran cold. "What man, sweetie?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Her daughter pointed to Donald's house. "He stands in the window and watches me play." That evening, Sarah and her husband set up a camera facing Donald's house. Sure enough, the footage showed him standing at his second-floor window for hours at a time, looking down into their backyard where their daughter played. Sometimes he held something in his hands, binoculars. They realized with horror. They filed the police report, though the officer who took it was sympathetic but clear. Watching from your own window isn't illegal. They couldn't do much unless Donald trespassed or made threats. The officer agreed to have a conversation with him. After that visit, Donald's behavior changed. He no longer appeared in his yard when Sarah was outside. The gifts stopped completely. But Sarah never felt safe again. They installed privacy fences, security cameras, and additional locks. They sold the house 2 years later, taking a financial loss just to escape the constant feeling of being watched. On their last day, as the moving truck pulled away, Sarah looked back one final time. Donald was standing in his driveway, arms crossed, watching them leave with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not angry, not sad, something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. Sarah ended her post with a piece of advice. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. Don't worry about being rude or hurting someone's feelings. Your safety is more important than their ego. If you're finding these stories unsettling, please consider subscribing to the channel. We share new horror content every week, and your support helps us continue bringing you these chilling tales. Let's continue with Story 3. Story 3. The Sound in the Walls. Here's an unsettling fact. The average house contains hundreds of feet of empty space between walls, under floors, and above ceilings. These voids are meant for insulation, wiring, and plumbing. But they can hide other things too. Things that shouldn't be there. This account comes from a series of blog posts written in 2018 by a woman named Melissa Chen. She documented her experience in real time, case updating her blog as events unfolded, which gives the story an immediate, authentic quality that's genuinely disturbing. The blog has since been taken offline at her request, but archived versions still circulate in horror story communities. This is her experience, pieced together from those posts. Melissa rented a duplex in Austin, Texas. It was one of those older conversions where a single house had been split into 2 units. She lived on the right side, and a man she knew only as Mr. Loughlin lived on the left. They shared a wall-to-wall that separated her bedroom from his. Mr. Loughlin was in his 60s, quiet and reclusive. Melissa had seen him only a handful of times in the 6 months she'd lived. They're usually just glimpses of him leaving early in the morning or returning late at night. He never made noise, never caused problems, and for the most part, Melissa forgot he was even there. That changed in March when Melissa started hearing sounds in the wall. At first, she thought it was pipes or rodents. A scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, always around 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. It would last for 10 or 15 minutes, then stop abruptly. Melissa mentioned it to her landlord, who sent someone to check for pests, but they found nothing. The scratching continued, growing more frequent. Then one night, Melissa heard something that made her sit bolt upright in bed. It wasn't scratching, it was tapping. Deliberate, measured taps, coming from inside the wall. Tap dash, tap dash, tap. Pause. Tap dash, tap dash, tap dash, tap. Pause. Like someone was communicating in code. Melissa pressed her ear to the wall and listened. The tapping was definitely coming from inside, not from Mr. Laughlin's apartment on the other side. Whatever was making the sound was between the walls. She knocked back, feeling ridiculous even as she did it. The tapping stopped immediately. Silence. Then, after a long moment, 3 slow, heavy thuds answered her. She called the landlord the next morning, insisting someone inspect the interior of the wall. Reluctantly, he agreed to send someone out. But before the maintenance worker could arrive, Melissa discovered something that changed everything. She was taking out her trash when she noticed Mr. Laughlin's basement window was open. It was a small window, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but through it she could see into his unit. And what she saw made her stomach turn. The basement walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them. They were pinned up, overlapping, covering every inch of the concrete walls. Melissa couldn't make out details from where she stood, but something about the display was deeply, profoundly wrong. The sheer number of images, the obsessive way they were arranged. She quickly walked back to her unit and locked the door. Her hands shook as she called the landlord again, telling him what she'd seen. He assured her he'd look into it, but seemed more annoyed than concerned. That night, the tapping in the wall returned, more frantic than before. But this time, Melissa heard something else. A voice, faint and muffled, coming from inside the wall. "Can you hear me?" Melissa grabbed her phone, ready to call 911, but she froze. The voice was male, weak and desperate. "Please," it said. "Please, I've been here so long." She pressed her face close to the wall. "Who are you?" she whispered. "He keeps me here," the voice said, barely audible. "In the walls, I can't get out. Please help me." Melissa called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. She explained everything, the tapping, the voice, the photographs in Mr. Laughlin's basement. The officers took it seriously, knocking on Mr. Laughlin's door. When he didn't answer, they announced they were entering the premises. What they found, according to the police report that was later leaked online, was disturbing, but not in the way Melissa expected. Mr. Laughlin's apartment was filled with audio equipment, speakers, microphones, recording devices. The photographs in the basement were images of walls, insulation, and structural interiors, obsessive documentation of the house's construction. And the officers found Mr. Laughlin himself, hiding in a closet, terrified. He eventually explained through tears that he was conducting an experiment. He wanted to see if he could make his neighbor believe the house was haunted, or that someone was trapped inside. He'd been playing recordings through a small speaker he'd mounted inside the shared wall. The voice Melissa heard was a recording. The tapping was mechanical. It was all fake. But here's the part that still haunts Melissa, the detail she included in her final blog post. When the police searched Mr. Laughlin's apartment, they found a journal. Page after page of handwritten notes about Melissa, her schedule, her habits, what time she went to bed, what time she woke up. He'd been watching her, learning her patterns for months. The experiment wasn't about ghosts. It was about her, about control, about making her afraid. Mr. Laughlin was arrested on stalking charges, but he was released on bail and disappeared before the trial. Melissa moved out immediately and never learned what happened to him. She ended her blog with this line: "The scariest monsters aren't in the walls. They're right next door, watching us, studying us, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. If this story got under your skin, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. We've got 3 more stories in this series, and they only get darker from here. Let's move on to story 4. Story 4, the mirror image. Did you know that the human brain is hardwired to recognize faces, even in random patterns? We see faces in clouds, in wood grain, in the arrangement of furniture. It's called pareidolia, and it's a survival mechanism. Ancestors needed to quickly identify friend or foe. But what happens when you see a face that shouldn't be there and it sees you back? This story was submitted to a horror podcast in 2020 by a listener named Marcus Trent. He sent it as a voice recording, and you could hear the genuine unease in his voice as he recounted what happened. The podcast host verified some of the basic facts with local news archives, and while the strangest elements can't be confirmed, the core events are documented. Here's Marcus's account. Marcus lived in a small apartment building in Richmond, Virginia. His unit was on the 3rd floor, and directly across from his bedroom window was another building, maybe 30 feet away. In that building, in the window directly parallel to his, lived a man Marcus had never met, but saw nearly every day. Let's call him David. David's routine mirrored Marcus's almost exactly. When Marcus woke up at 7 a.m., David was already up, visible through his window, making coffee. When Marcus got home from work around 6 p.m., David would arrive moments later. When Marcus turned off his lights to go to sleep, David's lights would go dark within minutes. It was uncanny, but Marcus chalked it up to coincidence. They probably had similar work schedules. But there were other similarities that started to bother Marcus. David was about the same age, same build, same general appearance. He wore similar clothes, lots of dark jeans and button-up shirts. He had the same reading lamp in his living room. It's the same brand of coffee maker, visible through the window. Even the layout of his apartment seemed to be an identical mirror of Marcus's. Marcus mentioned it to his girlfriend Emma, who laughed it off. "You're overthinking it," she said. Lots of people have similar stuff, but Emma didn't see David every day like Marcus did. She didn't notice the way David seemed to be watching, always positioned where he could see into Marcus's apartment. Things escalated one evening in October. Marcus was getting dressed for a date with Emma when he noticed David standing in his window, staring directly at Marcus's apartment. It wasn't unusual, but this time, David was holding something up to the glass, a piece of paper. Marcus squinted but couldn't make out what it said. He grabbed his phone and zoomed in with the camera. The paper had 2 words written in thick black marker: "I see you." Marcus's blood ran cold. He quickly closed his curtains and tried to convince himself it was a joke, maybe meant for someone else. But the message felt directed at him, personal. That night, he barely slept, and when he finally did drift off, he had vivid nightmares of David standing in the darkness outside his window. The next morning, Marcus opened his curtains cautiously. David's apartment was empty, curtains open, lights off. Marcus exhaled in relief. Maybe the guy had moved out. Maybe it was over. But when Marcus got home from work that evening, he saw something that made him drop his keys. His apartment had been rearranged. Nothing major. His couch was a few inches to the left. His coffee table rotated slightly, books on his shelf reordered. Small changes that most people wouldn't notice, but Marcus noticed, because everything had been moved to exactly match the layout of David's apartment across the way. Someone had been inside. Marcus called the police, but there was no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen. The officer who responded suggested Marcus might have moved things himself and forgotten. "Stress can do weird things to memory," he said unhelpfully. Marcus installed a deadbolt and a chain lock that night. He also set up a cheap camera pointed at his front door. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th night, Marcus reviewed the camera footage and found something impossible. At 3:47 a.m., the camera showed his front door opening, not forced, not broken. It simply unlocked and swung inward. But no one entered. The door stood open for exactly 1 minute, then closed on its own. The locks re-engaged with audible clicks. Marcus watched the footage 10 times, his heart hammering. There was no one there, no hands, no body. Just the door opening and closing by itself. Except if he paused at exactly the right frame, Marcus could see something. A shadow in the hallway. A figure-shaped absence of light. He couldn't stay there anymore. Marcus packed a bag and went to Emma's place, where he stayed for a week. During that time, he avoided looking at the footage again, tried to convince himself he'd imagined the shadow. But he couldn't stop thinking about David, about the mirrored routine, the mirrored apartment, the message in the window. When Marcus finally returned to his apartment, he found everything exactly as he'd left it. The deadbolt was still engaged. The chain lock was still in place. But on his coffee table was a Polaroid photograph. It showed Marcus sleeping in his bed, taken from the foot of the mattress, looking down at him. Recognized his sheets, his pillows, his bedroom, but he lived alone. He'd been at Emma's for a week. Marcus grabbed the photo and ran to his window, looking across at David's apartment. The curtains were closed. He'd never seen them closed before. Marcus called the building manager of the opposite building, claiming he was worried about a friend who lived there, giving David's unit number. The manager was silent for a moment, then said, "Sir, that unit has been vacant for 3 months." Marcus moved out the next day. He never found out who David was, or if David was even real. But he kept the Polaroid tucked away in a drawer where he doesn't have to look at it. On the back, written in the same thick black marker as the window message, was a note. "We're more alike than you think. If you're still listening, thank you. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this." We're halfway through our Creepy Neighbors series, so let's keep going with Story 5. Story 5. The Invitation. Here's something most people don't know, according to criminologists. Predators often test boundaries with small transgressions before escalating. A question that's slightly too personal, a visit that's slightly too late, an invitation that's slightly too insistent. They're feeling out your limits, seeing how much they can get away with. By the time you realize something is wrong, they already know exactly how far they can push. This story was shared on a true crime blog in 2017 by a woman named Catherine Doyle. She wrote, "It is part of a series on near misses, experiences where something terrible almost happened but didn't. Catherine's story is one of those cases where instincts saved a life." This is what she shared. Catherine lived in a townhouse community in suburban Maryland. It was one of those places where all the units look identical, with small front yards and shared walls. Her neighbor to the right was a single man in his 40s named Raymond. He'd lived there for years, long before Catherine moved in, and he had a reputation in the community as being helpful and friendly. He'd organized neighborhood cleanups, water plants for people on vacation, and offered to help with repairs. Raymond was the kind of neighbor people praised. "You're so lucky to live next to Ray," multiple people told Catherine when she first moved in. And for the first few months, that seemed true. Raymond helped her move a heavy bookshelf, recommended a good plumber, and kept an eye on her place when she traveled for work. But there were small things that bothered Catherine. The way Raymond always seemed to know when she was home. How he'd appear at his door moments after she pulled into her driveway, ready with a wave and a conversation. The way he'd mention details about her life that she didn't remember telling him, where she'd gone last weekend, what time she usually went to bed, what she'd ordered from the Thai place down the street. Catherine told herself she was being paranoid. Raymond was probably just observant. Friendly, lonely maybe, but her gut kept whispering that something was off. The invitation came in December. Ramon knocked on her door on a Sunday evening, holding a plate of homemade cookies. "I'm having a little holiday party next Friday," he said with a warm smile. "Just a few neighbors. Very casual. Would love for you to come by." Catherine hesitated, and Raymond must have sensed it because he quickly added, "No pressure at all. I know you're busy, but it'll be fun." Starts around 7. Catherine thanked him for the invitation and said she'd think about it. Over the next few days, Raymond mentioned the party 3 more times. Each time, his tone was a little more insistent. "You're coming Friday, right? Everyone's excited to see you there. Don't make me guilt trip you into showing up." It felt pushy, but Catherine didn't want to be rude. On Friday evening, she got dressed and walked over to Raymond's townhouse at 7:15. Music was playing inside. She could hear it through the door, but when Raymond answered, she immediately felt something was wrong. He was dressed nicely, the house was decorated, but she didn't hear any voices. No conversation, no laughter. "Am I early?" Catherine asked. No, perfect timing," Raymond said, stepping aside to let her in. Come in, come in." Catherine walked into the living room and stopped. The house was empty. No other guests. Just Raymond. The table was set with 2 place settings. Candles were lit. Soft music played from a speaker in the corner. "Where is everyone?" Catherine asked, her heart rate picking up. Raymond closed the front door behind her. "Oh, they're running late. You know how it is. Holiday traffic. They'll be here soon. In the meantime, can I get you a drink?" Every instinct in Catherine's body screamed at her to leave. There was no party. There never had been. She forced a smile and said, "Actually, I just remembered I have a work call I forgot about. I'm so sorry. I need to run." Raymond's expression changed. The friendly smile faltered, and for just a moment, Catherine saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. A work call. On Friday night? Yeah, international client. "I'm really sorry." Catherine was already moving toward the door. Raymond stepped into her path, not blocking her exactly, but close enough to make her stop. "Stay for just one drink," he said, and his voice had a hardness to it now. "You came all the way over." "I really can't," Catherine said, her hand on the doorknob. "Maybe another time." She left quickly, practically running back to her townhouse. Once inside, she locked the door and stood there, shaking. She called her friend Jenna, who told her to call the police. But what would Catherine report? That her neighbor had invited her to a party that didn't exist? That he'd asked her to stay for a drink? Nothing illegal had happened. Still, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just avoided something terrible. She started researching Raymond online, something she'd never thought to do before. She found his name connected to a news article from 8 years earlier. He'd been questioned in connection with a woman's disappearance, a woman who had lived in the same townhouse community. The case had never been solved. Raymond was never charged. Catherine moved out within a month, breaking her lease. Before she left, she warned every woman in the community about Raymond, though most of them dismissed her concerns. "Hey, he's harmless. He's lived here forever." 2 years later, Catherine received a message from Jenna. Police had arrested Raymond in connection with multiple assaults. Apparently, he'd been drugging women at small gatherings. He'd host gatherings where they thought other guests were coming but never did. Catherine had been right to trust her instincts. She ended her blog post with this: "If something feels wrong, leave. You don't owe anyone your time, your presence, or an explanation. Your safety is not rude. Your caution is not paranoia. Trust yourself." We've got one more story in this series. If these tales have kept you engaged, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. It truly helps the channel grow. Now let's finish with Story 6. Story 6, The Goodbye Gift. Here's a disturbing statistic. In the United States, an estimated 25,000 people are currently missing under suspicious circumstances. Some vanished without a trace. Some left behind clues that lead nowhere. And some left behind something far more unsettling, evidence that their disappearance was planned, orchestrated by someone who'd been watching them for far longer than anyone realized. This final story is different from the others because it doesn't have a clear resolution. It was documented through a combination of police reports, local news coverage, and testimony from friends and family. The central figure is a woman named Amy Restrepo, and what happened to her neighbors became one of those cases that true crime communities still discuss in hushed, uncertain terms. This is what's known about the events. Amy lived in a duplex in Tacoma, Washington. Her neighbors, a couple in their 30s, named Greg and Lynn Patterson, lived on the other side of the shared wall. By all accounts, they were model neighbors, quiet, friendly, kept to themselves. Amy would occasionally hear them through the wall, muffled conversations or the sound of their television, but nothing disruptive. In June, Amy noticed the Pattersons were packing. Moving boxes appeared on their porch, and a U-Haul trailer sat in the driveway. Amy wasn't surprised. People moved all the time, but she was a little sad. The Pattersons had been good neighbors for the 2 years she'd lived there. A few days before they were set to leave, Lynn knocked on Amy's door with a gift bag. "We wanted to give you a little something before we go," she said, smiling warmly. "Just to thank you for being such a wonderful neighbor." Inside the bag was a small wooden box, handmade and beautifully crafted. It had a hinged lid and a tiny brass latch. "Greg made it," Lynn explained. "He's a woodworker. We thought you might like it for jewelry or keepsakes." Amy was touched. She thanked Lynn, and they hugged goodbye. The Pattersons left the next day, and Amy didn't think much about them after that. Life moved on. But about a week later, Amy was cleaning her apartment when she knocked the wooden box off her dresser. It hit the floor, and the lid popped open. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Curious, Amy unfolded it. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a list. Her list. Her routines written out in meticulous detail. Leaves for work at 7:45 a.m., returns at 6:15 p.m., grocery shopping on Sundays. Goes running Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Bedroom light turns off at 10:30 p.m., the list went on, covering months of observations. There were notes about her habits, her visitors, even what she ate. At the bottom of the page, written in different handwriting, was a single sentence: "We know you better than you think." Amy immediately called the police. They took the note as evidence and tried to track down the Pattersons. But here's where the story becomes strange. The Pattersons didn't exist. The names they'd given, the information they'd provided to the landlord, all of it was fake. The social security numbers didn't match real people. The previous address they'd listed was an empty lot in Montana. The U-Haul was rented under a stolen identity. Police searched the Pattersons' side of the duplex and found it completely empty. Not just of furniture, but of evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace that anyone had ever lived there. The walls had been wiped down, the floors scrubbed with industrial cleaner. It was as if they'd never existed at all. But in the basement, investigators found something that made the case even more disturbing. Behind a false wall panel, they discovered a small room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a chair positioned facing the shared wall. On that wall were dozens of small holes drilled through to Amy's side. Some were at eye level. Some were lower, positioned to see into her bedroom, her bathroom, her living spaces. The Pattersons hadn't just been watching Amy. They'd been living inside a surveillance nest, observing her every move for 2 years. The box, investigators realized, was the goodbye gift. A final act of control. A way to let Amy know she'd been watched the entire time, but only after the Pattersons were safely gone. The case made local news, and tips started coming in. Other people came forward claiming they'd had neighbors matching the Pattersons' description: a couple. Quiet, friendly, who'd lived next door for a year or two before moving away without warning. Each person who came forward reported the same thing. They'd received a gift before their neighbors left. A piece of pottery, painting, a handmade item. And inside each gift, hidden carefully, was a note listing their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Police identified at least 6 other victims across Washington and Oregon, though they believe there are more. The pattern suggested the Pattersons, or whatever their real names were, had been doing this for years. Moving into duplexes, townhouses, and apartment buildings where they could share a wall with their target, watching, learning, documenting, then leaving with their goodbye gift. A calling card that said, We were here, we saw everything, and you never knew. The most chilling part? They were never caught. Despite a multi-state investigation, despite media coverage, despite the FBI getting involved, the couple simply vanished. No one knows who they really were, what they wanted, or why they did it. The surveillance seemed to be the point, not theft, not violence. Just the act of watching, and the final reveal that they'd been there all along. Amy moved out of that duplex 3 days after the discovery. She's since changed her name and relocated to a different state. In an interview with a true crime podcast, she said she still can't live in a place with shared walls. She checks every room for hidden holes. She covers every window. And she never ever accepts gifts from neighbors. The case remains open. The FBI still maintains a tip line. And somewhere out there, that couple might be living next to someone new, drilling their small holes, watching through the walls, preparing their next goodbye gift. That brings us to the end of our Creepy Neighbors series. 6 stories, 6 different kinds of terror, all centered around the people living closest to us, the ones we're supposed to trust, the ones we wave to in the morning and say goodnight to in the evening. These stories serve as reminders that we never truly know who's on the other side of that wall, that fence, that property line. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't hiding in dark forests or abandoned buildings. They're living right next door, wearing friendly smiles and offering helpful hands. Where were whiting? If these stories resonated with you or terrified you, they should please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you new horror content every week, from true stories to urban legends to unexplained phenomena. Your support means the world and helps us continue creating the content you love. Stay safe out there. Lock your doors. Trust your instincts. And maybe, just maybe, introduce yourself to your neighbors. Because the scariest thing of all might be realizing you have no idea who they really are. Until next time, sleep well. You can.